Morning. Whoa, everyone. Those are nice and hot. Welcome to Csmac meeting. Okay, good. Welcome to the Csmac meeting. We're a few heads down, but we have a full agenda, so let's go ahead and press on. And those that aren't here don't get to play the reindeer games. So a couple things on logistics. As you'll note, the microphones are somewhat sparse today. These microphones, Dave, correct me if I'm wrong, are the ones we need to be using? Okay, so when you put your table tent up, what we'll do is try to identify you guys and get the microphone passed. Please wait until the microphone is in front because this is obviously being recorded as well as being transcripted. The little ones, what are the little ones for? Just the room? Okay. Yeah, so that's a little bit on the logistics. The mic situation is what it is, so we'll work with it. We'll work with it. That's it on logistics. Thank you to Mark and the law firm for Morgan Lewis. I forget the last name, but Morgan Lewis. Sorry about that. Thank you. Apologize. I thought I had it in my head. No. But thank you anyhow. These are very nice digs. So thank you very much. Very easy to find. It's nice to be in a large space. So thank you so much for this. I think that's a lot of the logistics to get out of the way. Anything else we need? Okay. So let's get. Excellent. Thank you. All right. Yeah. So let's do a quick round the table so we can do a roll call. Carl, let's start with you and we'll go clockwise.
Alan McKenzie, Virginia Tech.
Rick Reitzer, Raytheon.
Mark Crosby, EWA.
Paul Colazzi Consulting.
Mark Racek, Erickson.
Michael Kettler, Briefing America.
David Reddle, Ntia.
Larry Alder, OneWeb.
Or Gibson ComSearch.
H. Atkins and TIA.
Dennis Roberson and Associates, and Illinois Institute of Technology.
Andrew Roy, Aviation Spectrum Resources.
Ryan Tremont, Wilkinson Barker Nauer. Mark McHenry with Shared Spectrum.
Charla Rath with Verizon.
Dale Hatfield, University of Colorado.
Erlen Kahn Miter.
Len CTAA.
Okay, and Steve Sharkey just walked in. This is like last night's White House dinner. Steve Sharkey. Yes, yeah. Okay, so that's the Csmac members in the room. Are there Csmac members on the phone?
Yes, hi, Jennifer Warren.
Hi, Jennifer.
Hi.
Kurt, you on the phone? Okay. And Bob Weller, are you on the phone? Okay. Too bad. Okay. Then let's go around the room, same direction for visitors. Let's start. Okay. So that's it for logistics. Everybody should know where the restrooms are, I hope. If not, ask one of them. That, I think, is it for the logistics and the check-in. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dave Reddle, who's going to make some comments. Welcome, Dave, and thank you for being here.
Well, thanks, guys. Good morning. Welcome to the first Csmac meeting of the year. It also happens to be my first, which I have to say, out front, I'm excited to be here. I know most of you. I've had the opportunity to work with the vast majority of you over the last 15 years of my career, which has been entirely spent in some way, shape, or form working on spectrum policy. So I'm really excited to be here and to get dug in on the hard work that you all are doing. I know we're at that point now where it's time to start looking at teeing up questions for the next Csmac, which we'll be constituting later this year. And the next cycle should be an interesting one based on all the work that this group has done and the work that's been teed up by Congress and by the administration going forward. I think it's worth starting off by noting that this group was ahead of the curve. And I thank you all for all the work that we've been doing that now has been memorialized in Mobile Now Act, which was passed as part of Ray Baum's Act in the Congress. The work you guys have been doing on finding ways to incentivize federal government spectrum users to get more efficient and finding ways to promote deployment on federal lands has been a good groundwork, a very good groundwork for us to get started from. We're now digging in with a renewed vigor based on these at Ntia to make sure that we can comply with what Congress has asked us to do, but also so that we can continue the good work of this group. Among the other things we'll be working on, beyond those few that have already been mentioned, identifying potential bands for repurposing in both the low and mid bands. These are priorities in the legislation and ones that this group has been working on, not just this cycle, but seemingly for its entire history. And we're looking at ways to streamline the deployment on federal lands by working through our broadband interagency working group as well. So the work you all are doing is helping Ntia and the Rural Utility Service in our co-chairing of that group. Also, the administration, we're taking a big picture look at spectrum use. And on that front, I'm happy to report that Ntia has been working with the administration on pursuing a new national spectrum strategy. We're working with the White House and other agencies to take a hard look at the existing spectrum memoranda that are part of the White House's approach to spectrum and trying to put an Ntia and certainly a spin that this group would find very familiar. We're working on that actively, and we're hoping to have something coming out soon. But in that vein, I'd like to announce that we're going to be having a Spectrum Symposium later this year. We're holding it in June, where we're going to bring in folks to the National Press Club from both academia, from the government, from private sector, to figure out ways that we can focus this work, bring in sort of best practices that have been working, and really take a hard look at the approach that has been taken by the U.S. government for the last 8 to 10 years and how our updating it can make it more resilient, make it a more flexible approach that more approximates the way that we really are actively looking at this every day at Ntia. It'll be a half-day morning event, and we hope that you guys will all be able to attend. I think I skipped over the date. The date's June 12th. So as I see Ann Weigel, who does our public affairs, nodding her head at me like, please get the date out there, David. The one thing I wanted you to make sure you got out there. We welcome you guys being there and helping us in the dialogue. Meanwhile, we're continuing across a broad front to make progress on making more spectrum available. As many of you know, we were happy to announce that the PPSG has selected 3450 to 3550 as the next candidate band for potential repurposing. That's a band primarily used by the Department of Defense, and we're happy to be digging in and doing the hard work of looking to see how we can make the systems in that band coexist with others. We continue to work with the FCC on Citizens Broadband Radio Service, CBRS, the 3.5 spectrum. ITS Boulder is hard at work with our both FCC colleagues and the private sector in trying to get to yes on the SAS and ESC we are going to need in order to get that band deployed and get it out there and providing service to the American public. Also, we're working actively with the Commission, as many of you probably have seen, to make sure that as we go forward, we continue to protect the Table Mountain site. I'm sure you're all aware Table Mountain is our quiet zone that ITS Boulder maintains outside of Boulder, Colorado, where we do RF, R&D. Maintaining that as a quiet zone is a priority for us, as the hard work that they do, the important work that ITS does is dependent on a controlled RF environment. And so I thank you all for your continued help in making sure that Table Mountain remains a place where we can do this good work. Still working on Frontiers, as well as a number of you. And I think the most important thing to also add is the Spectrum Pipeline Act work that we're doing. 1675 to 1680 and 1300 to 1350 have already been approved, and the work to produce pipeline plans for those is ongoing. There are other bands that are in the works that we're hoping to get pipeline plans on very shortly. And we're going to continue to work actively on all these fronts to make sure that the work that we're doing here and the work that we're doing at Ntia and in the interagency process continues to all work productively to make more spectrum available. Other contributions we can make to help the spectrum environment, as I mentioned, ITS Boulder, the area of interference protection, detection, and monitoring is an area that we are very actively working on and working with the FCC as well. I suspect we'll continue to try to find ways to collaborate with the Commission on this effort, as it's going to continue to be a contentious area as we try to squeeze more out of the low and mid-band spectrum that we are already using in this country. And on one last sort of initiatives front, I would note that if you have not seen, Secretary Ross has been very active in promoting the promotion of the Office of Space Commerce within the department from a NOAA sub-office to be directly under the Secretary of Commerce, and to take a more active role in providing a one-stop shop for the commercial space industry, whether it be for satellite launch or for communication services within the Department of Commerce. As you know, we continue to be the group within the federal government that works on both policy and spectrum when it comes to federal users, and we're working closely with the Secretary's office to make sure that as we go forward, we're all working hand in glove to get the best outcomes for our commercial space partners. Last but certainly not least, many of you are active at the ITU, and I would be remiss if I got to any public forum and did not mention the fact that we are running a candidate to head the development sector. Doreen Bogdan-Martin, who is known to some of you, but not all of you, former NTIA employee who has spent the last 25 years working in Geneva at the ITU on these issues in the executive secretariat there. You know, if you're going to run a candidate from the United States for an international position, it helps to have the very best candidate, and we certainly do. And so I urge all of you, if you have not been active in this, to please do everything you can to help us promote her candidacy. Doreen's more than qualified, and I think perhaps more interestingly, if she were to be elected to one of the 5 elected positions, she'd be not only the first American elected to one of those 5 positions, she'd be the first woman in the 153-year history of the Union. So a big opportunity for us as we head into the Plenipotentiary Conference later this year. So with having got the laundry list of things I wanted to mention to all of you out of the way, I thank you again for all of your hard work, and I look forward to joining you in it over the course of the remainder of this cycle.
Thanks, Dave. I noticed from the agenda I jumped a little bit and did the roll call sort of out of order, so mea culpa. However, having said that, we're at the point where we'd like to welcome our visitor, Matthew Hussey. Welcome, Matt. I think that now we're at the point where we kind of share our collective thoughts on things, and I'll get started. It looks like the work is going well. I've been participating in some of them, particularly the enforcement one, and probably have some comments that the brief has done. But it looks like we're getting to a point where we're going to have recommendations in the time frame that we're hoping for. So thanks to everybody for the hard work you're putting into it. It looks like it's paying off, at least in terms of recommendations. So keep going, and we'll be ready for the outbrief I guess it's in Boulder. That's about all I have to say, Larry.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the first time we got together this year since we've kind of reconstituted. Last year was a pretty big push to get through the one-year cycle, and I think it was pretty clear from David's emails we're on even a shorter cycle this year, so it wasn't fast enough last year. So just to restate the obvious, we're shooting, as Mark said, for proposed recommendations in the Boulder meeting, which could potentially be the last meeting of this group. There's a possibility, there's an if necessary meeting potentially in the fall, but we're shooting to wrap things up in the July Boulder meeting, as Mark was stated. So thanks again, and we've kept the same subcommittees, kept the same subcommittee chairs, just to keep that momentum and add on a little bit to what was done last time. And as Mark said, the work seems to be going really well. The few subcommittees I've attended, the discussions have been fruitful.
Great. All right, thanks, Larry. I just want to add that I got an email from Bob Weller. Bob Weller is actually here, but on the phone. Everybody should know that. So I think that's it. So now at a point, I'll turn the thing over to Paige for the Spectrum update.
First of all, I'd like to thank Mark and Larry for kicking us off, and I want to welcome my boss to his first CSMAC meeting. We are very grateful for his leadership and his wealth of experience on spectrum policy. And I promise you, I'm not just saying that because my mid-year review is next week. So as traditional, I'm going to start off with a recap of some of the major accomplishments and activities since our last CSMAC meeting related to spectrum policy and management. You know, as Secretary Rettel noted, Congress passed significant spectrum-related legislation and the provisions of Mobile Now in the FY18 appropriations package. And it really will set a large portion of our policy agenda over the next couple of years and beyond. Some of the tasks, I won't repeat everything that David mentioned, but we are tasked to work with FCC collectively, as we have done, to identify an additional 255 megahertz of spectrum divvied up in different ways. I do want to note that that includes any spectrum that has been identified since early 2016, I think. Yeah, 2016, February 2016. So we will be working with the Commission to move forward, but it's much of what we have been doing day in and day out. In addition, we will be looking at 3100 to 3550. We've been tasked to develop a report and determine if there are opportunities in that band. Of course, we've already identified 3450 to 3550 for detailed study, and we will be supporting the Commission in looking at 37 to 42. Another element is the incentives that Secretary Riddle mentioned earlier as well. We will continue our work on incentives for ensuring the federal agencies are as efficient as possible in spectrum use, as well as supporting the Commission on a study and report on bidirectional sharing, which we are all very much interested in. And the last item I'll mention is working with the Commission to develop a national plan on unlicensed use and policy. So we have our work cut out for us. Luckily, a large amount of this work represents continuity with what we have been doing and the ongoing and collective efforts that we've all been working with spectrum repurposing and incentives. And the work that Csmac has done has been a large contributor to those discussions, activities, and accomplishments. So again, I want to thank all of you for that contribution. Meanwhile, we continue to partner with the agencies, the Commission, and continue to assess and identify the most promising bands for potential repurposing. As David mentioned, 3450 to 3550 has been identified. We continue to work with the Department of Defense as they develop a proposal, pipeline plan proposal, to do a study to determine the potential for sharing or repurposing of that band for commercial wireless services. And we hope that as a result, this will be a true win-win and enable continued growth in the wireless industry, as well as protecting critical radar operations that are critical to our national security. And the adjacency to the CBRS band, as well as the potential for international spectrum harmonization, makes this truly a nugget and a potential avenue for great benefit to all of us globally. So we're very excited about it. And I want to highlight that the heavy lifting, when we talk about band prioritization and selection for repurposing, is really done through the Policy and Plan Steering Group, or PPSG. And for those that aren't familiar with the PPSG, it is an interagency group composed of senior level government officials representing really, the major spectrum users across the federal agencies. And they advise us, and particularly Secretary Riddle, on spectrum policy matters. And the Csmac's input on characteristics of bands for commercial deployments, which we'll continue to talk about today, will help us refine and improve the PPSG's band prioritization and selection process as we continue to look at opportunities for repurposing. And I want to emphasize that process never stops. So we are continuing to look at opportunities regardless of what legislation or other mandates come out from the administration. We also continue to focus on the transition of bands already allocated. And I think, in particular, CBRS, we've partnered very closely with the Commission, with the Department of Defense, with Wind Forum and industry to make this a success. And this is a highly technical collaboration. It's been very successful. We've talked about that in the past. And it's really looking at fairly unprecedented technologies and approaches, such as the spectrum access systems, the environmental sensing capabilities, and the related standards and equipment associated with that. And though the schedule has slipped a little bit from what was originally anticipated, we are still making good progress toward the eventual goal of making spectrum available and operational for CBRS specifically. We look forward to the WIN Forum completing their standards and software work, which is a key input to NTIA and in particular to ITS, our lab in Boulder, to move the path forward toward SAS and ESC certification and testing. I also want to remind folks that this really is not only novel in terms of the original three-tiered licensing approach, but we have also moved to dynamic protection areas versus the static exclusion zones as originally envisioned. And that's to not only protect military radar, but make the most out of the band that's possible. And it's a significant pivot point to more dynamic spectrum sharing between federal and non-federal users. Meanwhile, as was mentioned, we continue to work with the Commission on frontiers. I'll let Matthew speak to that in more detail. And across all of these activities, we have collectively discussed many times the need to address effective enforcement as an integral and essential component to successful sharing. And I tend to use the term enforcement very broadly, which we've talked about in this forum. So we decided to come up with a new acronym, IPDR, Interference, Prevention, Detection, and Resolution, which encompasses how we think enforcement, not just in the traditional legal sense, but how do we enable sharing across the board more holistically. And so NTIA held an interagency IPDR workshop in February to facilitate an open dialogue between federal government spectrum users, NTIA, and the Commission on radio frequency interference between federal and non-federal users. There was consensus that we needed to improve our ability to deal with interference and that our challenges would become even greater as we transition to a more sharing paradigm. It was a great dialogue. It mirrored much of what we've discussed here in Csmac, topics such as data sharing, training, automation, and interrelationships between interference and cybersecurity. And this was just the first step, and I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get into our responses to your last set of recommendations. We're going to continue these interagency discussions over the next few months with the intent to then engage industry in the process in the future as well. And hopefully this may help us frame new topics or areas that we want Csmac to focus on for the next cycle. So I'm really excited about this effort as well. Now, I've reported in the past about our efforts to study ways to improve efficiency of federal spectrum use. Since our last Csmac meeting, ITS published a technical report that reviews more than 50 years of studies examining domestic and international spectrum efficiency. And this report really highlights the difficulty and complexity of applying generalized spectrum efficiency metrics across dissimilar systems and services, especially in a spectrum sharing environment. By that I mean, how do you characterize efficiency as a result of sharing? What metrics to use? And this report helps set the foundation for us as we move forward and continue these efforts and help us hone future research areas that OSM and ITS will be working in partnership to address. So these efforts will continue. They will also feed our Mobile Now response, particularly in the incentives report that will be due. I believe that one's due in 24 months. We also continue to flesh out an NTIA industry collaboration plan, which we will use to guide our efforts to increase broad-based collaboration with the private sector. We hope this will drive the development of things like workshops, conferences, such as the conference in June, as well as things like notices of inquiry that we can leverage, all to increase the transparency of what we do and to build greater dialogue with industry groups and companies. A lot of this is credited to Csmac and the feedback that you provided to us some months or maybe a couple years ago on this construct. And Csmac will continue to be a central point for us in terms of getting industry feedback and recommendations. But we are committed to broadening and deepening that collaborative activity across not only industry, but academia and other stakeholders. A key result will be the symposium in June, and it will be open to the public. It will be a discussion around key spectrum policy goals and initiatives, and we will get more information out to everyone. And I look forward to seeing, hopefully, most of you there in the process. Now, as we begin to wind up this current Csmac membership term, we are seeking recruits for the next term. And the Federal Register has published our solicitation for membership submissions, and I certainly hope many of you will continue. I will remind you that if you want to continue, you have to submit your package as well. So don't assume that you will just continue without submitting your package. And I can't thank everyone enough. I've often talked about the collective wisdom of this group and the importance that we place at NTIA on your input and your recommendations. And hopefully you've seen that as we've reported out on actions that we've taken as a result. And you'll see more of that a little bit later. So before I turn it over to Matthew for the FCC Spectrum update, I wanted to remind folks that the next meeting will be in July in Boulder in concert with ISART. And I encourage you all to participate in ISART if possible. I'm also hoping ITS will be able to give the Csmac an update on their recently signed cooperative research and a development agreement with the University of Colorado Boulder. And this will result in a new spectrum monitoring test bed, providing mutual benefit to both CU as well as ITS, and we're really excited about that activity. And I think it will help fuel discussion in many of the areas that we've been discussing. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to Matthew unless somebody has any questions for me. First time?
Really? Okay, I wanted to make one statement just to sort of amplify the spirit of cooperation that the CBRS community, the SAS community have had working with the teams from NTIA and ITS. It's been intense, but it's also been productive. And I'd like to specifically thank people like Rebecca Dorch, Ed Drusella, Bob Soul, and Nick Lasorti for the countless time they put into making this work. It's been great, and we really depend on the work, and so thank you for those assets. All right, Matthew.
Thank you. Well, it's certainly been mentioned many times about the close collaboration between NTIA and the FCC, so I won't sort of go into too much there. But the FCC does continue its efforts to make more spectrum available in the low, mid, and high band frequencies. As everyone's aware, the incentive auction was held in the 600 megahertz, cleared about 84 megahertz of spectrum. We are about a year in to the transition period, and the first licenses were issued in June of 2017. With regards to mid-band, we're working on the Citizens Broadband Service at 3.5 and also initiated a mid-band, excuse my throat's going, notice of inquiry at 3.7 gigahertz to 24 gigahertz. That was in July. And in that notice of inquiry, we asked several detailed questions about 3 particular mid-range bands and also asked commenters to identify other mid-range bands that might be suitable candidates for expanding flexible use, wireless use. So, and then in that high band, as mentioned, the Spectrum Frontiers, looking at opening up spectrum in the 24 gigahertz. We had a report in order, and further notice of possible rulemaking in 2016, and then R&O in November of 2017. And that actually frees up about 13 gigahertz of spectrum. Oh, thank you very much.
Collaboration between the agencies.
Yeah. See, there is great collaboration. Oh, much better. So now I feel how Marco Rubio and Trump feel now.
I don't think so.
Maybe not.
You had to open the door to that, didn't you, man?
Yeah, really.
Yeah.
Keep going.
I was thinking about that. But the recent 2017 order opened up 1,700 additional megahertz, as well as started initiating service rules. And then we also initiated Spectrum Horizons NPRM in February of 2018 to look at opening up spectrum availability above 95 gigahertz. So there's a lot of activity of trying to free up, make more spectrum available for wireless use. Also, the FCC initiated proceeding in examination of Section 7 of the Common Communications Act as a way to expedite new and novel technologies to market. Not familiar with that section. It's basically tells the FCC to examine new technologies, look at public benefit, and if there is, to really kind of expedite it to the market. Hadn't really, was kind of not very detailed in its structure, and so there have been calls to examine that, and that's one of the things that the chairman has looked into as a way to, again, speed up new technologies to market, to remove regulatory barriers for that effect. The FCC also had officials participate in NTIA's federal workshop on preventing, identifying, and resolving interference that was held a few months ago. Really good conversations between the agencies, and certainly look forward to participating in additional discussions and work groups from that initial meeting. And also, with the passage of the Ray-Baum Act, there are several responsibilities in the areas of spectrum, several sections that the FCC is tasked with, which we've been working very closely with NTIA, as mentioned, developing a national plan for unlicensed, as well as a report on bidirectional sharing. And in regards to the TAC activities, the first TAC meeting was just held a few weeks ago on April 12th, and it was a lot of new topics. One that was carried over was the mobile device theft prevention, to continue work on trying to look at technologies that will mitigate theft of mobile devices, smartphones, etc. And all the other ones are basically new, such as the Future of Power Working Group, which is looking at battery power technologies as well as wireless charging techniques. There's also a computational power and stress on networks, which is kind of looking at blockchain, big data, Bitcoin mining, gaming, and the impact that has on network infrastructure and the stress that it provides. And so they're going to look at technologies as ways, the effects that those new emerging services and technologies have on the network. The other working groups that may be of interest to this committee is the 5G and IoT working group. They're tasked with studying and reporting on the state of the development of 5G era IoT applications across various sectors, kind of looking at the relationship between 5G and IoT, and kind of developing categories, performance metrics, as well as use cases. They're also looking at market developments, if there are any barriers, as well as kind of a comparison of domestic and international marketplaces. And then also an examination of spectrum use policy, maybe making recommendations to remove barriers as well as the modifications to spectrum policy to accommodate, obviously, the incoming IoT storm that's about to hit. But the goal is certainly to also establish and determine what the Commission as well as other agencies can do to facilitate. So that's one of the areas where there could be some opportunities for collaboration between the TAC, Csmac, in regards to that. Another working group is the communication strategies for UAS working group, unmanned aerial systems, and they're looking at just basically spectrum issues for UAS, examining the various frequency bands that UAS uses, as well as what are some future bands that could be used, as well as the possibility of harmful interference and ways to mitigate that. And also, one of the big issues is you have all these UASs, what's the impact on radar? And so that they're looking into examining that impact with regards to radar and whatever future changes might need to accommodate. And another aspect of that is possible changes to the FCC regulatory structure, spectrum management, proliferation of UAS devices. Obviously, that's a very big issue with FAA and others, so that's another possibility of collaboration. And then finally, there is an antenna technology working group. They're looking at emerging technology, antenna technologies such as adaptive phase array, massive MIMO, and multi-user MIMO, and really reporting on the status of the development of antenna technologies and their implications to FCC policy, technical standards, regulatory issues, as well as technical issues. And this certainly could work with Csmac's spectrum efficiency, because obviously, evolving antenna technology is there to make more efficient use of spectrum. And so those are kind of the recap. The next, the next TAC meeting will be held in June, I think June 12th. So if you want to make a note of that, that's my report.
All right, thanks you, Matthew. Any questions for Matthew?
So this is Paige. I just wanted to reiterate that both the Csmac and the TAC are doing great work, and we want to look at opportunities to leverage these activities when there's synergy. And we have several members that are members in both camps. But as we look at, in particular, the next cycle, if there are opportunities for the two committees to work together on certain topics, or at least to complement each other on certain topics, we would like to discuss that and see if that makes sense moving forward.
All right, no questions for Matthew? All right, we're moving right along. Okay, so the next thing on the agenda is the response to the 2017 recommendations. Dave. This. Okay. That's out of Singing in the Rain. I can't believe it. Okay. Okay, so thanks, Dave. All right, now we're spectrum recommendations.
Back to you. Okay, so what I'd like to do now, and hopefully everybody has a copy of the slides, I'd like to talk about our preliminary response to the last set of recommendations that were completed in November. And again, we really appreciate the Csmac's input. We seriously consider your recommendations and make a determination on what actions we should be taking, can take, or may not agree with or defer based on those recommendations. And what I'd like to do today is give you some insight at a high level, just some select actions that we will be pursuing based on this last set of recommendations. We won't cover everything, particularly as it relates to the 5G committee or subcommittee, because there were so many recommendations. We just want to give you some highlights. The goodness is that most of your recommendations do align with ongoing activities, ongoing priorities. That's by design, as well as will be very supportive to our response to legislation such as the Mobile Now provision. So it all ties together very nicely. And I will caveat by saying that the actions that I'll talk about are subject to change based on resources and evolving priorities, as you all know. So for 5G, and again, the 5G subcommittee had many recommendations to consider. And so we just selected a few key actions to give you a feel for how we're responding. In the first bullet, what we're going to do, and this goes back to many of the recommendations being aligned with what we're doing already, we are going to leverage our current processes and initiatives, including what we're doing to respond to legislation, both the Spectrum Pipeline Act as well as Mobile Now, to continue to look at opportunities and requirements for spectrum sharing. And this, in part, is related to how do we define our requirements that can then feed the standards process that will allow us to collaborate with industry to ensure that we're all doing the right thing to enable spectrum sharing between federal and non-federal systems. This could include things like workshops, notices of inquiry, again, and we will continue to collaborate both with Csmac and the stakeholders at large to determine how we move forward and how we define those requirements. That's related really to the second bullet, which is around establishing a strategy to more effectively engage and influence standards. And in particular, from our perspective, to, again, enable sharing between federal and non-federal entities. And we want to thank the Csmac for their input to date. We have drafted a strategy, and it is in with the subcommittee for review and feedback so we can hone that strategy and start implementing it, again, for greater influence and engagement. And so we're looking forward to that. And then we also want to continue to work with the agencies, industry, Wind Forum, to monitor the effectiveness of the 3.5 sharing mechanisms that are put in place with the Commission and start documenting best practices and lessons learned as those systems are deployed and we see how they actually effectively operate or not in the process. And then the last item I wanted to highlight is we have started looking at probabilistic analyses for sharing. We started that about 5 or so years ago, and we continue to move down that path, expand those approaches, implement those approaches, and encourage others within the federal agencies to also adopt those approaches. And what we'd like to do, the reports on those approaches have been, I'll call them one-offs on a case-by-case basis. And we would like to capture that more holistically and document something in what we're calling for now a best practices handbook to help bring the federal agencies and the stakeholders together to move toward those probabilistic methods and approaches. So again, those are just some highlights in terms of what we plan to do in response to the 5G recommendations. Any questions on those before I move on? So for enforcement, we talked a little bit about our new acronym, IPDR, and you'll see that in the slide. A new acronym, yes. Well, what we mentioned earlier, we held this interagency workshop. It was great dialogue, a good first step. And what we want to do is continue to leverage the, I'll call it IPDR, workshop methods as well as other processes to investigate, in particular, automation. And again, think broad definition of enforcement to include some of the things that the committee, the enforcement subcommittee specifically recommended, which you see on the slide. And these discussions have already started. They started in the first workshop. So we're collectively on the interagency side trying to get arms around what we see, what the issues are, the magnitude of those issues, what we project for the future, and how can automation help those challenges. And as I mentioned earlier, in the future, what we'd like to do is convene a workshop or some venue with the private sector to help us look across not just technology, but also process and policy in terms of enhancing our ability to address IPDR challenges, especially related to federal and non-federal users and sharing. again, high level. Any questions on that?
Sorry. Okay. Back on the 5G one, you mentioned kind of
Too
one-off
late.
sharing study. What's that?
Said you're too late.
Yeah. That's right. It takes a while sometimes. The one-off sharing studies that you mentioned, are those available publicly?
Yes. Whether it was the earlier ones that we did or other, like even feeding the 3.5 assessments, all of those studies have been published. And so look out on our website, and they would either be OSM and or ITS studies, many of them jointly published.
Okay, thanks.
And again, so we publish them kind of case by case, and we want to look at things across the board more holistically. Okay, key band characteristics. I mentioned the PPSG and our process, our band selection and prioritization process, and we asked the subcommittee to give us some feedback on how industry looks at bands and values bands in terms of its characteristics. Because what we try to do in our process is not only look at the federal side and say, what is the art of the possible in terms of ensuring operations are protected and whether sharing might be possible or relocation might be possible. The flip side of the equation is what's important to industry as we look at prioritizing bands for potential repurposing. And what we're doing is we're continuing that work during the next few months with the subcommittee, and we have asked them to try to develop a methodology around those characteristics that they identified, which included propagation and coverage, capacity, contiguity, international harmonization, and incumbency issues. And what I would say is our current process really includes all of those things already, but we still need to fine-tune and refine the process and better understand how we would better integrate those characteristics and weigh those characteristics in the process. So we're looking forward to the additional feedback and recommendations from the subcommittee so we can refine the process, which we are currently undergoing right now. Any questions on that? Quiet group today. And the last item is spectrum efficiency. And part of what we're doing this year is really wrapping up last year's activities. I think the subcommittee ran short of time in trying to get certain interviews and other data collection efforts underway. So they are going to be wrapping up and providing some additional recommendations, particularly in terms of policy and other types of activities that we might want to consider. But what we did get from the subcommittee was a list of some lessons learned or best practices in terms of how industry garners more efficiency in their own systems. And we particularly asked about methods to garner more efficiency across disparate systems, but this was also, some of the input was for like systems as well. Several of the lessons that were identified are already currently integrated into current federal policies, as well as things like Pipeline Act. So one of the recommendations had to do with how do we look at either similar systems or systems with similar capabilities or technologies or characteristics and see where we can combine and reduce the footprint of spectrum use across federal agencies. And that's really what Sensor is all about in terms of the spectrum efficient national surveillance radar program. It's about collapsing and reducing the footprint across surveillance radars, DoD, DHS, and FAA, and then looking at integration of weather radars as well. Again, reducing the numbers of radars, the footprint of the radars, while still achieving the capabilities and the operations that are needed. So we can always do better, and we'll look at ways to do better. but a lot of those recommendations are consistent with our current practices. And then we continue spectrum efficiency activities, again, in partnership with OSM and ITS. And this year, we will be focused on developing metrics and methods to help a user, an entity, a federal entity, look at trades and make better decisions from a spectrum efficiency standpoint. And I would say this is not an easy issue, as many of you are aware. Spectrum efficiency is hard to define, and again, it's harder to try to generalize it across disparate systems. So we're looking at ways to do that where it makes sense and is simplistic enough that people can actually apply it effectively. And then we continue to look at other market-based or other incentives that will, again, feed our response to the Mobile Now report as well.
It's, excuse me, Brian Tremont at Wilkinson. You mentioned looking at the spectrum efficiency metrics as a foundation for looking at trades, and I wasn't sure what trades you were referring to in that context.
So metrics, I'll give you an example, say, a simplistic example. Say a federal agency is looking at a terrestrial-based solution versus an air solution to perform a certain function. And you may be able to look at those two and compare the spectrum efficiency as part of the decision points of which solution you would go with, or a technology on a platform. So it's giving them metrics that they can use to compare alternative solutions and make a better decision, as one example.
I mean, I think OMB A11 was trying to get at that from a financial perspective. Is it a different way to look at it? In other words, it's a more technical
So I would say OMB A11 in particular, if you look at what's in there and the practicality of implementing it and leveraging it in an efficient and effective manner, it's difficult. So this may eventually help us refine A11, working obviously with OMB in the process.
Okay, thanks, Paige. No more questions? Okay, good. Can't tell if that's a question or just moving the mic. Okay, well, thank you. Now we get into the subcommittee out briefs. I'm going to sort of chair the first two, and then I'll hand the mic over to Larry to do the rest of the meeting. So without further ado, I think we're at the 5G committee, and I think that's you, Mark, right? Great.
Okay, good morning. So the work within the 5G subcommittee is based upon the recommendation from 2017. So Paige went over that. Primarily, that was a recommendation that Ntia engage and lead in activities within industry SDOs, or standards development organizations, to get away from the acronym, to support standardization in spectrum sharing type of technologies, but also with the related aspects of enforcement and database. So the 5G subcommittee, I guess everybody's got a handout. The NTIA provided a proposed draft strategic plan for NTIA engagement with standardization development organizations. We've had 3 meetings where we've looked at the proposal. We've provided comments. We've had quite a bit of dialogue with NTIA. We feel for the most part that we'll be able to address all of the comments. As a matter of fact, one of our recommendations is that we would actually conclude the comment cycle on the draft document and address all of the comments by our next meeting, which is going to be May 9th. The feeling is that we would like to go ahead and get that document back in the hands of NTIA so they can go ahead and benefit from engagement, within the standards organizations right away. There was one particular comment that we feel like maybe we want to spend a little bit more time on. So that was sort of the feeling is we don't want to hold up the document just for that purpose. And the longer term recommendation that you'll see in the presentation is is to go ahead, and we feel like maybe we need a little bit more of a more formal process or engagement with NTIA. I think, Paige, you sort of alluded to a little bit of that already, and maybe this can help sort of inform that type of activity. But this is to, within this draft NTIA document for engagement, there is a lot of interaction with the industry, priorities, input documents, those sort of things. But there wasn't really sort of a formal way of actually doing that. And so what we would be doing is to, the first sort of activity that we want to get engaged in is to consult with ITS. So we're looking to maybe have them in a conference call at our May 9th meeting to actually see how they engage with industry, to see if there's something that we can learn from that and maybe use that as part of our recommendation. We're sort of looking for openness, transparency, setting priorities, those sort of things from a more formal type of process. So that's our longer term view. We're not sure that we can necessarily get all of that done by the May 9th meeting. Might take a little bit longer than that, especially once we start maybe getting into the NTIA organization and seeing how a proposal would actually fit with the NTIA recommendation, but maybe we might be able to flesh out some framework.
Okay, thanks, Mark. That was good and brief. Any questions for Mark? You have any questions? Okay. Okay, thanks. So I have one quick question. What do you think you're going to present in Boulder? You think, based on how that goes with ITS?
A whole new process.
Cool.
I think in Boulder, we should be able to talk a little bit more, or maybe make a recommendation on a more formal group with some of the things that the formal group would actually be engaged in. A little bit more definition, I believe. But we'll also be able to conclude on the draft document that was distributed. We'll be done with that, so we can present that as a conclusion.
All right, good. Thank you.
The only thing I would ask is that you keep in front of the discussion is the resourcing. Obviously, we're all resource constrained, and one of the areas we'd like to do is leverage industry as part of the process, not as just a feed to then a more heavy government process and engagement from a standardization standpoint. So we need to think about how can we gain the most synergy across all the players involved and gain the best influence in those forums and processes.
That's where we feel that having a discussion with ITS to see how they actually engage in using that maybe as an example of a process will help us understand sort of what resources they actually use, and then we can go ahead and translate that into the draft paper, see how we can improve the process there.
Okay, thanks again, Mark. Okay, Charla, I think you're next.
Yeah, thank you. I'm taking my cue from Mark and actually holding the microphone because I tend to turn around a lot. Otherwise, I don't want to have that sort of Doppler effect of moving back and forth.
Technical.
Ooh.
You do it really fast, you'll sound like you've sucked in helium, so.
Okay, thank you for that. So Paige has already talked about what it is that this group is doing this session. But just to remind people, what we did last session is we identified key characteristics that we thought should go into the process of identifying spectrum for sharing. And they include, this is all in the deck that you have before us, which, by the way, is a very short deck. I think we may even win on the shortest deck. But proper propagation and coverage, capacity, contiguity, international harmonization, and incumbency. And those are not in any particular order because one of the things that we were really challenged by last session was, in fact, that depending on the service that you might be considering sharing with, and depending even within services, the type of service you might be offering, or even particular companies might have a different idea or a different approach, those things may actually take on a different level of importance. What we were asked to do this session was, in fact, to develop a methodology to help assess federal bans for potential sharing using these characteristics, which I have to just say from the outset, the difficulty we had is the same difficulty we had last year when we were asked to rank them, which is how do you develop a methodology when there are so many different, potential uses and ideas. So what we started out doing, and we do have a draft paper that is looking at this. What we started out doing is to look at it in the context of the bands that we identified last time. And what we chose to do is actually sort of take those bands and put a little bit of a finer point on them: low frequency below 1 gigahertz, medium low 1 to 3, medium 3 to 6. And then we did sort of take all of the high band and above 6, which of course might not actually work for certain services as well. But that said, so what we've started to do is to see if there is some, is there a methodology that can come out of this? So that's what we're working on now. We've actually had a couple of, what we did is we actually identified a subgroup early on to kind of work through these things. We've probably met more frequently with a subgroup. And then Tom and I plan to hold a meeting in a couple of weeks to actually, with the larger group, to really walk through all of this. What I'd like to do at this point is actually go a little bit off subcommittee, because one of the things that we really felt like we wanted to do here was to get feedback from the larger committee on this issue that might be helpful to us moving forward. So I'm going to throw out just some things that I've been thinking about, and this is not representative of the subcommittee. And I'm actually thinking maybe what I should do first is just ask members of the subcommittee if they have anything to add to, the dialogue that we had internally, if there are things that they'd like to add to what I've said here. So several of you are here. I open the floor. Anybody want to add anything? So one of the things that's come up, and actually Larry is the one that mentioned this, but we probably should have thought about this. There's also an investment component to this, and in fact, I'd like to point out that a couple of, probably 5 or 6 years ago, your chief economist, Julia McHenry, actually wrote a paper that talked about the impact of sharing on investment in a particular industry, in the wireless industry, when you're actually talking about auctions. So I do think that, that's an interesting thing that we ought to be thinking about. The other thing I throw out to the group is whether or not this methodology might be just a series of questions that you should be asking. Not as simple of what are the propagation characteristics, but maybe more along the lines of, are you actually, what is the use of the band now? Is this a use that would benefit from, being moved, or is it one where you would share more like CBRS? Maybe questions like that. And I'm just throwing these out to sort of generate, I hope, a little bit of feedback. I don't know if those are the right questions. We haven't even talked about this within the subcommittee. As I look at my notes, that's basically where I wanted to end. And I just, again, throw it out both to members of the subcommittee, since some of this is new information, as well as we had all talked about this, that we really did want to open it up to the larger committee to see if there were any things that, folks could give us, some thoughts or guidance and things we could take back into the committee to think about. Any first thoughts from the subcommittee, and then I open it up. Hopefully I'll get...
So I see Rick up first and then Donna. Okay. Rick?
If the subcommittee wants to go first, that'd be good. Are you the subcommittee?
So I have a couple of questions on that. The first is the impact of auctions. I wasn't sure what that point is. If you could sort of delve into that a little bit so I can think about it. And the other is, when we think about the use of the band, I think that is important, and I think that is sort of maybe even like a public policy idea. And when we look at that, I think that when we look at what can be done by the incumbent service the first thing is, would they benefit from moving? And I guess when you look at that, you look at the cost and the efficiencies and who deals with that. The other is, what does the sharing look like? And I think there is a third point, which is where is their technology going? And maybe if the technology that's already in there is going to use the band in a more efficient way, as opposed to growing the spectrum they need, they're developing, or they're already developing technologies that will use the spectrum more efficiently and therefore be more susceptible to interference. I think that is also something we should look at, because I think we should not stifle technology that is in development or already developed, because I know certain types of technology, as they become more efficient, so that they can use more bandwidth and put in more users, actually are more susceptible to interference. So I think that is one that I would add to our other 2 points in.
And actually, you, in a way, answered the question you asked me, because really it's a question of, if there is a cost to moving, is it then a band where you might want to be looking at auctioning it, because you actually generate revenue that can, under law, be used to help move. So that was really all the point I was trying to make there.
And further to that point, and we can discuss this in the subcommittee, so we don't have a meeting here. When you look at auction, there's a cost to the user. It's not just the physical cost of equipment or the timeline to move it out. I think that is the auction going to make enough money, and does the person who's buying the is there a point at which you buy the spectrum and that's not enough money to move users out? So that's not, I think that if we're going to look at those relationships, we should, sort of delve deeply into it to make sure that we have all bases covered, assuming that we decide that that's a road that should be looked at.
Yeah, and I appreciate this, but just so I'm clear, my thought wasn't that we should actually work through what all the questions should be here. I was really actually just posing the question of whether that would be a useful methodology to actually look at questions that we can agree to in the subcommittee. And in a way, I'm looking at Paige, because I think that's really, a question for you. So
I will say that we didn't provide you our process today because we didn't want to bias your thoughts. And I would say that also some of this dialogue mirrors some of what we actually do in our process in terms of investment and value, and would it garner enough potential revenues to cover costs, et cetera, as well as things like, is there a possibility of relocation or just sharing, and how does that affect the dialogue? So I think thinking through the questions could be helpful and ensure that we're not missing anything, or that we are framing the related process or the process related to those questions in the appropriate manner. Did that make sense?
Okay, Rick, are you up?
Yes, I'm up. Rick Reeser from Raytheon. I wanted to sort of turn this a little bit on its head. One of the things I've thought interesting about this group, and one of the reasons I didn't participate in it, was because I think you need to think about all the parties. So in addition to just saying, okay, this is what I would like to have in this house that I want to move into, or whatever. And if part of the thing is that you're going to be roommates, maybe we ought to find out a little bit more about what the incumbents, what they would take a look at in terms of sharing, moving, and all those kind of things. Because it's sort of great to say, here's my last territorial demand kind of a thing. But I think it's also important to understand in this process, like what can the what can the incumbent do, or what would be good for them, and what would they do? And then you can actually have a dialogue about that, because ultimately, after you go through this process, you're going to end up having this dialogue anyway. So it might be useful to sort of understand from the perspective of the person, because they may be open to sharing, but they got to have these conditions met, and there's certain things I can't give on, and so forth, or I can't move, or maybe I can, and have both parties kind of lay that out. And maybe part of the process could be setting up what those questions might be for the people that are already there.
All right, put your table tent down. I had a question, and it's obvious to me, but maybe it's not an obvious question, and that is the sharing paradigm. I mean, take a look at, for example, the 3.5 gig band, the CBRS band. The sharing paradigm is a SAS. A similar sharing paradigms have been proposed or suggested for sharing in other bands. So what benefit or what impact does the sharing paradigm have on the likelihood of the band to be shared? If it's plain old command and control frequency coordination, does that make it easier than using an automatic sharing process like a SAS or some DSA process? It would seem, yeah.
Question. The question I have about that is that isn't the sharing paradigm somewhat determined by what's already in the band?
Yes, but we could be doing right now, for example, in the CBRS band, we could be doing command and control frequency coordination. There's nothing that says we couldn't do that. And in fact, as you probably are well aware, that was the paradigm in the bands, at least before CBRS came along. So, the question I think would be, what made me think about this was the investment component. You don't have to invest a lot of money to do a command and control frequency coordination process. There's lots of companies out there, like ours, that do that. But no one has built a SAS yet. Well, we're doing it, but and so if a command and control frequency coordination, I'm just using this to juxtapose against another automatic or automated paradigm, if it's going to take substantial amount of investment to build an infrastructure to effectuate sharing over just using what's out there now, does that have any impact? And I don't know the answer to that question, but I'm asking is whether that question is a question worth asking. That's all.
Just to add, I caution that you don't get too far into the details, because think of this as the first filter. So the process that we're using helps us, select, prioritize and select. But then that selection, like 3450 to 3550, then has a much more detailed analysis on relocation versus sharing, and more detailed costs, and more detailed assessments on incumbency issues, et cetera. So think of it as, again, the first filter that helps us select the most promising bands that then we can collectively study in much more detail, if that makes sense.
Okay. Any more questions for questions? Okay, good. Is that helpful?
Yeah, no,
okay.
I actually found it helpful. I don't know if any of my...
So let me go back and ask the same question I asked Mark, and that is, what do you think you're going to have to brief in Boulder?
Our intent is to actually have recommendations, and to move forward. Hopefully, we'll be able to share the draft.
Okay, good.
I'm looking mostly because a lot of they're like lined up. That's our intent at this point.
Good.
We'll keep you posted if we're really having problems getting to that.
Okay, great. Thanks. Okay, you want to get that mic? I want to keep this one for a page.
Before we move on, I did actually have a question on the topic, because when we say methodology, because you said come up with a list of questions, and to me, what I was thinking is we did the characteristics, now it's a methodology. So what comes to my mind is some kind of almost scoring system or way to prioritize and assimilate the characteristics to make decisions. That's the intent. Okay.
Well, and that again gets back to my initial comment, is that we have found very difficult to do because it is so dependent on, what the end point is going to be. I mean, I'm sitting across from people who do satellite, and I suspect we might agree on some things, but then there are other points that are much more important to the satellite community than they are to our community. So that has put us in a position where we do not feel like we can come up with that kind of methodology. So we're looking for other ways to be helpful. And in fact, I wouldn't necessarily think that asking a series of questions is a form of a methodology. It's a different way of looking at it than what you've said. But let me, again, we've had a lot of conversations about this over the course of not just this Csmac, but the last set of questions. So I don't know if anybody has any thoughts.
Yeah, I think that, as Charla said, the challenge sometimes you have when you have technologies that don't mirror one another, like U10 and terrestrial systems in a specific band tend to all be the same, and satellite systems can operate in the same band, and the designs can be very different. It's just up to the operator. So I think that you can't necessarily look at it in the same way. Thank you.
I didn't want to throw a wrench in that work, but I guess we got some directional guidance from Paige on keeping it a first level filter. So that was good. So I guess we'll move on now to the next topic, which is going to be the enforcement topic. And I guess is it Mark? You're going to?
I'll start and turn it over to Paul. Who knew that such a little simple question could be so complicated?
We have an acronym now.
Yeah, we do. No, actually, I want Paige to note that we synced this up with IPDR. So all of these three, and thank you to Mary Brown, who said this. We probably need to split the initial question into three pieces. What are the technical capabilities of the SAS systems, and what are the legal issues, and what are the policy issues, and so I at least got that all synced up. And thank you to Mary Brown. And we've had a couple meetings, and I think we're making progress. But it's a tough issue, and we want to obviously provide some value to the Csmac and NTIA. So we've met a couple times. We will meet again. I can't wait to answer your question. What are we going to deliver in July? At this point, I'll turn it over to Paul.
I thought the answer was whatever Paul says.
I hope that was caught on tape. That was brilliant.
Thanks, Mark. What a team. So I'll go over a little bit what the status is of the IPDR process and what we've been thinking of. I think that in some respects, being an enforcement group, we sort of need to enforce ourselves to try to be a little bit cognizant of what we're trying to accomplish. And so we've had some initial inputs from folks, which has been excellent. We're trying to get some more inputs for people. They've been very busy and trying to understand what some of the challenges are. We have a challenge in respect of trying to, and this will be helpful from you, Paige, to try to provide the whole subcommittee some ideas. People tend to lock in on what current SAS or what has been expected by current SAS. And so therefore people tend to lock in on that. It's like, well, this is not what the current SAS is doing, so therefore we're not going to do that. And the idea is that I think we're trying to get the subcommittee to open up a little bit. It's the SAS concept. It's the SAS, capabilities that you've been discussing, not necessarily the exact implementation of current SAS systems. In fact, there is no current implementation of a SAS system yet, in the sense of being deployed. So, and so that's one of our challenges, because what most people are going at is like, listen, the current SAS systems don't do a lot of the sensing that we're talking about, and so therefore, how does it apply? So there's been some questions on that. There's been that SAS systems don't directly control the communication of the devices themselves, and so therefore how are you actually going to have that kind of feedback? But they do have a feedback. And so the mechanism is, there is a feedback mechanism, but the question is it a direct one? And so the question is that a limitation, and there's a policy limitation associated with that, and possibly a legal limitation associated with that. Ergo, what Mark just mentioned about those three categories. The couple comments that also came up were, in some senses, that how are you doing the deputization of the enforcement process if you go down that? So that's a nice legal policy, actually more of a legal question, how you deputize particular SAS or these kind of capabilities to do enforcement. And so what are the challenges about that? So we're trying to walk through some of those issues, as Mark was saying. And finally, is the participation in this, and so this goes back to the current SAS systems versus a future SAS system. Mark actually came up with a great statement, which is this a voluntary process or is this going to be a requirement? So when you're thinking about capabilities out there, are you looking at trying to deputize to the point where now you're forced deputization, meaning if you're going to be part of this process, you have to actually provide these functions in addition to your current functions. And so there's been some challenges there where people are trying to meander through that. As a techno geek, I have no problem at all. I just don't really care about any of that stuff. I look at what's possible and where to move on. But I think the committee could use some help in a sense of guidance as to, is it really the current SAS systems, or if you actually read the question does say SAS systems and technologies. And so it doesn't say current SAS systems. It doesn't say CBRS SAS systems. It says SAS systems. And so I'd like to put it back at you, Paige, is how do you foresee us trying to go at this?
And that wording was crafted in a way, particularly the addition of technology, systems and technologies. So it really is conceptually not tied directly to what we have today and limited by what we have today.
Right. Okay, so good. So that'll help us as we're trying to formulate some of these ideas. And again, I'm going to bring it back to the whole subcommittee that after I go through this, if you think I got something wrong, yell. Brian's already goes, I'm ready here. But he's thinking. The next steps is, even though it is about the systems and the technologies in a sense of a generic point of view, we want to learn a lot more about what's going on in the SAS community and the SAS developers. We have a couple people on our committee from the SAS community, but we want to try to maybe do a more full review, and not review, but a questioning of them and trying to find out where everybody is coming from. Because and I'm not going to go through this, but if you go to the last last 4 pages, I think 3 pages of the presentation, I actually cut and pasted out some pieces of the CBRS rules and some of the things that the WIN Forum has been trying to do. And commenting on that, I think there's some different perspectives. There's some measurements that are supposedly going back and forth, and people say, oh, no, they don't make measurements. Well, actually, they don't make measurements, but they get measurements, and that's a different process in itself. So I think we need to open up our aperture as a community to ask the questions, what does this kind of technology enable us to do? And so we thought we needed to take a look more at those things. We need to look at still, though, what is the current level technology? So we want to look at 2 pieces, look at where we are today and what can happen with the SAS technologies, and then what could be happening in the future. So I think we want to kind of separate those 2 pieces because we don't want people to get confused, like, oh, you're saying that the SASs today can do all this. I think we're going to try to make sure that that's definitely separated. So we're going to basically go out in this next few months and try to understand a little bit more about where everybody is at, and then try to, with that new guidance, is I think try to wrap in what the possible future might entail. And I want to open it up to the rest of the subcommittee if I got off script too much, if they have any comments.
Oh, I'll take the con on it. This is a hard question to answer because I think the fact that you're looking at SASs and what they conceptually can do, I mean, you had it really well established here with these 3 questions along the technology, the legal, and policy issues. I mean, and you asked me to answer the questions as a SAS provider, and I said when on the call, no problem. And then I sat down to try to answer them. I'm like, whoa, this is like an essay question kind of thing. And so, I think that, and from a SAS perspective, I think we get the willies a little bit when we deal with enforcement in a situation. And I think this is the deputized enforcement thing. And I think we brought this up in a meeting a while back where a SaaS provider is providing a commercial service pursuant to a set of rules that are established by the regulator, in this case, the FCC. But our customers are the end users. If you put a SaaS provider in a position of tattling on their customers, ratting them out or whatever you want to say, that freezes out or chills out the market. So we have to kind of figure out a dividing line between what is, and I don't know whether this is a policy discussion or a commercialization discussion, but I think it overhangs this, of putting a SaaS in a position of doing ex ante versus ex post. And I think we have some of those issues going on as well. We are right now doing ex ante enforcement. For example, we have to verify FCC ID. We have to verify that the power that a device gets is the maximum certificated power, not the maximum allowed power. And a couple of other little things. And I think for all intents and purposes, although we're getting to it rather difficultly, we're getting there to the point where at least the SaaS providers, and I'll just speak for us, adopting it. It's causing no small amount of consternation among us because of the potential for a slippery slope. Because if you can do this, you can do other things. And I think we have to kind of, and maybe this is something incumbent on the SaaS providers working within the framework we have within WinForm and the regulatory discussions we have, finding that line that we don't want to cross. And I don't know where it is. It's a little blurry, but I know there's a line out there, and it's somewhere along the points of, if I'm offering services to somebody and I have a responsibility of either turning that person in for a violation or disabling that person, the ecosystem is going to collapse to some extent. So,
right. So let me see if this clarifies it. I think where you're trying to get the dividing line is what is meant by the word enforcement. Yep. Meaning, if it is a self-enforcement, which what SaaSes are doing in some respect by telling people turn this power down or whatever because you have a possible interference issue. That's one area. If you're talking about a legal enforcement where you're giving a regulator information associated with, that's another one. And so you're looking at that dividing line, which is a good discussion point to do that. I just don't want us to lose it that everybody thinks it's the one.
Yeah.
Maybe we need to do is distinguish, assuming this, what can you do? And assuming that, where's the uncomfortable feature? Is that a reasonable?
Yes, and I think the other problem you had, which is probably the reason for the dearth of responses, is the SaaS providers are knee-deep, if not neck-deep, in everything else going on. And so I think it would be really fruitful, because a couple of us are already on the Csmac, to have a Q&A or an interview session or something. Because I think that a lot of this is really, I think the questions need to evolve based on the answers. And I think it's worth having a dialogue on this within this context so we can work on this together. And I said this a year ago, I think, when we broached this discussion, that the SaaS providers really need to be helpful. I did my job. So, but I'm on the committee. But I think also that this question needs to we need to continue considering this question in the context of as SaaS has developed, because they touch two of the key regulators, which is the Ntia and the Commission. So there will be a lot of lessons learned as we roll these things out as to how this gets effectuated. And so it would really be good to keep this going on, because I think this could sort of bidirectionally not influence, but at least inform a lot of what's going on in the various regulatory bodies.
Well, it could be a big enabler.
Yeah.
If we do it, if we can do it right.
So Paul, why don't you finish up, because we've got a lot of interesting questions here.
I'm finished up.
Oh, you're finished up.
I opened it up to the committee if they want to actually make comments.
All right, so we've got, I see 5 questions up here. Why don't we start with Carl down there?
Okay, all the questions will be dealt with by Mark.
Yeah, quick answers. Yes or no?
Mark.
Yes.
Now, mine's just maybe more of a suggestion, Carl Povolitis. I think one of the things you probably would want to look at, and this goes to Mark Gibson's point, is incentives in participating in a SaaS and that type of thing, to the extent that I see this comment here, one of the bullet points, it says SaaSes today do not directly control devices. There may be some entities that don't want the SaaS to directly control devices, or that may be a disincentive to participate in that band. So I think incentives may be something else you may want to look at.
Thank you. Could the incentive also be economic? Yes.
Rick Reeser from Raytheon. I want to sort of draw this back to some of the comments that Paige made at the beginning, because ultimately it kind of moves in some of the directions that NTI has been talking about in terms of monitoring is one of the things, because I think one of the thoughts was when we saw the SAS out there, well, gosh, that's going to be like the ultimate monitoring system. And maybe there needs to be a dividing line between SAS functions and general spectrum monitoring functions. But I think that would be something that needs to be thought of in terms of what the overall construct and architecture is for how that might work. Because one of the things that may come out of this is this issue of having, some sort of monitoring system within the U.S. for multiple purposes, not just for SAS and so forth. But the thing that kind of will drive that, I believe, is the technology for monitoring. And I think that, and we've talked about in our group, and I'm want to encourage that, maybe we should talk to some people that do monitoring, what kind of technologies are out there, and the issue of a small spectrum analyzer that can be remoted and those kind of things, and what kind of information you might report. Because at the end of the day, in the last meeting, I sort of mentioned, you can drive all the way now from the airport to Boulder and never see a toll booth anymore. I mean, it's all remotely monitored, right? Everything, paying, keeping track of stuff. So at the end of the day, we may be headed down that path. So maybe we need to look at the technology, and maybe the SaaS provider is not the one that's going to do that. Maybe they are, but what's going to drive that is the ability and the technology to monitor.
This is Paige. Just a quick follow-up. If you want to talk to folks about monitoring, I will offer, though they're not my organization, ITS, would be a great start in working with Keith and his team.
I've already reached out to Keith, so yeah.
Michael.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Michael Calabrese. Two things. First, just I guess a response to what Mark Gibson said is I think that's certainly a valid concern, although I don't think it's the primary consideration. I certainly don't think the subcommittee should not look at options because of its commercial impact on SaaS, potential SaaS operators. For a couple of reasons. One is that ultimately the SaaS is just a sort of outsourcing of the regulatory function by the FCC primarily. So it's simply it's simply stepping into the shoes of the commission and doing something more, presumably more efficiently that the commission would otherwise be doing if, in an ideal world, and similarly in terms of NTIA. And so as long as the rules are clear up front, all the stakeholders know what for example, in the CBRS context, this is what the commission is seeking to accomplish, and the SAS is simply effectuating that as a proxy for the regulatory agency. It's not about the SAS making money, although obviously it has to be balanced enough so that somebody can make a sustainable, operation out of it. And then secondly, here we're primarily concerned with what NTIA's interests are, which could be in enforcement, even if that means kind of pushing the envelope in terms of what the FCC or SaaS operators feel comfortable doing. So I just think you should look at all the options. And then secondly, I would, and the reason I put my card up initially was I actually just second what Rick said essentially, which is that if we're looking at systems and technologies more generally, including going forward, I would think things like crowdsourcing spectrum measurements would be a great thing, because if base stations are in communication with the SAS anyway, they could be sharing what they're hearing in the environment, and that in turn could inform enforcement.
Okay, I need to respond. So I know we got others waiting, but I can't let if we want to have SaaSes run by commercial people, it is absolutely about them making money. It has to be. Otherwise, you won't get commercial people to do it. Now, and we won't get into whether they can make tons of money or a little bit of money, but it's if a commercial entity is going to be running a spectrum access system, it's going to be about the commercial entity being able to do it. Otherwise, then it becomes a non-commercial exercise, and that has issues associated with it. So, and I appreciate where you're coming from, but again, if this were not about ability of a commercial entity to run this in the context of the not just the rules, but all of the working against other SaaSes, competition, then it would be done by the federal government or somebody else. That would be the only one, and that's how they would do it. So I need to address that. And the other thing is, and I think to the monitoring question, I think that was touched on. You have an excerpt in the rules here. I will tell you, and I think that this could be resonated by some of the device folks. That is really difficult to get a lot of device manufacturers to allow other data coming out of the devices. There's good reasons for that, and we can get into that when we talk about this. The set of information that the devices report back is not the same thing you're getting from an ESC, and so we just need to keep that in mind. So anyhow, yield my time.
All right, thanks. Brian.
Okay, thank you. It's Brian Tremont from Wilkinson. I'd like to endorse that Mark should make money, so let's stipulate that should happen. However, I did break out in hives when he was talking for the following reason. It cannot be the case that SaaSes compete against one another based on how much or little they enforce, right? It cannot be a product differentiator. There has to be a baseline that the commission enforces against. There has to be no discretion from the SaaS about when they act and when they don't, and there has to be no discretion across them. So I think that is a critically important part, and I thought you were saying we're competing on how much they're enforcing, and I was, yeah. Okay, good. Whew. Scary, very scary for a moment. The second piece I wanted to flag was the legal piece, and I liked the construct of the 3 questions. What I struggled a little bit, and maybe it's answered by Paige's response on the technical side, is it an assessment of the degree to which private parties can enforce rules writ large, the degree to which the current SaaSes can enforce in the CBRS context, or some future case of what the idealized enforcement legal model is, and then, as a somewhat remiss member of the committee, has there been is that a legal assessment that we're doing as part of this, or how does the committee leadership view all those things together?
Okay, so I think I actually should give it back to Mark. But anyway, I'll jump and say this is how we actually tried to, a little earlier, divide the enforcement, right? As to what is, in a sense, a normal, a legal type of enforcement where you're actually trying to have regulatory agencies or somebody be involved in trying to take action, versus an enforcement that is actually part of the operational system to try to prevent interference.
So like ex ante versus ex post?
Correct.
Is that the, okay.
Well, and it's also, one of them is it a legal, are you doing a legal construct, or are you just simply doing something to make the system work better and you're actually enforcing? And again, there is going to be...
legal, but okay, go ahead.
Right. We have to actually ask the question, where is that line, right? And then the question I think we were trying to do is just say, given this is the line, what could you do? Given this is the line, what can you do? And we're not going to try to make I think the subcommittee should not try to make recommendations as to where the line is. I think what the group is trying to make is recommendations as to, if you had this line, what could you do?
Is the line the CBRS line?
No. In fact, Paige
that was the technical question.
No, that was, I'm sorry.
We were advised to stick to 3.5.
So it is CBRS.
Okay.
Right.
It's not just current staff.
They're not going all over the place.
On the legal
3.5.
Okay. But not the technology of 3.
We're not, my understanding, to clarify, is we're focused on the 3.5 band, but it's not just this discussion about what the current SaaSes and ESC can do, because they already have certain limitations about them. So we can project what they might do in the future and but we're staying in 3.5.
From both a legal and a technical perspective, or just from
Sure,
a
why not?
Technical perspective?
Well,
Sorry?
That's an interesting question.
That would be a question for Paige and the group, but my understanding is, sure, the only restriction is 3.5.
We have to stay in that box. That's my understanding.
So I think the reason for 3.5 is, one, it is here and now. That's the most mature activity. The band is conducive, as we understand it, to these kinds of technologies and concepts. And it would be most relevant to us to understand what we can do or not do in the near to mid to long term, future. But we don't want to constrain ourselves to specific implementations as we see them today.
Let me extend.
Yeah, I feel like I'm being
I'm
dense.
a little confused because I'm a little bit confused as well then, because if you're talking about what the legal and policy issues are, there have been legal and policy set down by the commission rules. So do we use those as the basis of that, Or do we say, is it a possible other policy and legal issues?
Let me take a crack at that, Paul. Let me take a crack at that, and I'll put some. So the example that I think is relevant is the ESCs. My understanding is they have a very tight function in the 3.5, and they're restricted legally and regulatory to do a very specific thing. But the concept of a sensing network could be quite broad. And so I think what we're thinking about is what could a sensing network evolve into? And that's both a legal and a technical question. So I think they're both open. That's my interpretation.
Okay, so one result might be recommendations for changes in the rules of 3.5 on enforcement.
Exactly.
Which could be considered.
Okay. Just
The other thing I would add to that is that while I said the ESC and the sensing capabilities that are defined in the rules are different, one of the reasons the sensing capabilities other than the ESC are defined in the rules, the function of the ESC versus the sensing capabilities in the rule is separated. ESC has one function, as Larry said. And the only reason the ESC is developed is because you can't effectuate that function by the sensing capabilities that the rules identify. However, to the extent that you want to put a SAS-like concept into another band absent the ESC, you have a defined sensing network by the devices themselves, and I think that's the intent of it. So if you think about the distributed sensing network that's provided by the devices, that's why that's there, is to make better decisions on the spectrum grants based on ground truth. So that should be helpful.
I want to get to Dale because he's been extremely patient over there. That is you, Dale, right, with your hand?
I just had a couple of thoughts here. One, I'm concerned, as Hank Page just said, this is here and now. We're about to deploy some of this. I think there's experimental licenses out now for some of this. So I'm really concerned about the timing issue. In other words, if we haven't resolved these things, we're going to be turning on a system fairly quick, if I understand what the industry is saying. And there's just issues that I am uncomfortable with. Probably the major one that I'm uncomfortable with currently is there's going to be interference in this band that has nothing to do with the systems that are under this control. And how does that? Who is responsible for that? If you pick up information, for example, that says there's something drastically wrong in downtown DC someplace, there's some problems. It may not be because one of your devices is misbehaving or something. It may well be the interference is coming from maybe an adjacent band. It could be intermod. My colleague here will immediately say something, but I won't put that. But my point is there can be other interference in that band, and it's just not clear to me what the interface between that is and then the FCC. And if you're collecting information and so forth, I think there's issues of how well you maintain the evidence, of what evidence do you turn over to the FCC and things like that. Because, or what if somebody, it's unlikely, but what if somebody just don't want to play with the rules? And, refuse to do what you kind of tell them to do. That seems to me, that's when the person has to come out with the proverbial gun and start enforcing it as the regulator would. So that part of it still bothers me quite a bit. The monitoring, I've said enough. Of course, the monitoring would go a long way, but then immediately get into who pays. Because to look at some of these interference things that I'm talking about requires a different sort of monitoring than what's set up.
Let me address.
Yeah. Did you guys want to address? I think you wanted to respond a little bit more.
One thing, Dale, just to give you a bit of comfort, is that the whole notion of interference reporting is evolving within the context of this discussion at the Commission. SAS administrators are actually meeting with the Commission on Friday, I think, to talk about that. And we're going through a lot of that. It is a work in progress. We are responsible to report interference, but how is that done? How, is it a common interface? There's all of that stuff. The whole notion, I think, of collecting information is really, I think that's where I get the willies, because, if we've got to maintain, and we talked about this on the call, if we have to maintain data in a fashion that's subject to evidentiary proceedings, that puts a whole different standard on the SAS with respect to the data that we maintain and everything we have to do. So that's a bit of a concern, I think, as well. And I think the other thing we have to do is define the line between what's the role of the Commission versus enforcement versus what's the role of SAS. And I think that is evolving as well. And I think, again, we're learning things as we're doing this, but nobody can say with clarity what exactly that line is, and that's what I was talking about earlier. So that's why I think that, there will be lessons learned as we embark upon this path called SAS. And there will be lots of opportunity to share that as the Commission's going to require it, to fine-tune what you're talking about and concerned with.
Is there a proceeding that's taking place at the Commission? Is this transparent? And
Well, it's just with the SAS providers and the Commission under the auspices of our conditional authorization that the Commission expects us to come in regularly to discuss topics of note with respect to our certification. So the rules require that the SASs do some level of enforcement, although they don't call it that. And so the big question right now is the one about interference reporting and how that gets, how we do that. And other things. I would suggest if you want to be part of that, contact Paul Powell or even Matthew, and your involvement would be well received. And I say that personally, not from the staff standpoint.
Take back
Before you,
everything I say if it's going to be more work.
again, Dale, because I've been on one of the calls with you, and Paige will comment, but I do think that in terms of scope, the scope of this committee is not really to comment on the current proceeding and advise on the current proceeding. The scope of the committee is to talk about the extent that SASs and ESCs could facilitate automated enforcement, which we now call prevention detection. IPDR. So I hear your concern, but actually I think that's beyond the scope. Paige.
You said it. So I was just going to mention that it's not to say the SAS and ESC is the end-all be-all for this process, but how, again, to the extent that it can be leveraged to satisfy the needs of IPDR.
Okay, I think Janice.
Other questions on this very active subcommittee? Janice has a question. I didn't see that.
So I guess this is the lawyer at the table. I can't imagine having a circumstance where the SAS does not report abuse to some government entity. Otherwise, what's the point of even having a SAS, frankly? Because if something's going wrong and the SAS says, no, I'm not responsible, then you're going to have a redundant system in the government. And obviously that probably undercuts a lot of what the SAS said they're going to do. And I think at least, you talk about Rick's toll booth deal. That's already happening in the big world, Some private entity is running the, HOV lanes. And if I mess up, I get a bill from them. It's all privatized. And then, if I complain, then I go to the government. And I think that's kind of an inevitable model that's going to have to exist in the spectrum environment.
One thing I'd say is that the SASs are not responsible for protecting against rogue operation. That's kind of where the Commission comes in, because they have the wherewithal to do all of the whatever they need to do to enforce that. And again, this is the line we're talking about. You're right. But what we've got to do as we're working through here is find where that line is, because there are certain things that SAS can report on that we have to report on. But you've got a bad actor out there that's intentionally being a bad actor. It doesn't matter whether there's a SAS or not, they're going to be a bad actor. So what is the role and responsibility? And I think that that's probably beyond the scope of this discussion. It's an academic discussion and indeed probably technical as well, but it is out there. So, okay.
All right, Mark and Paul, anything else?
No. So when you ask me, what are we going to submit for July? We'll have a lot of recommendations. I'm not so sure that the subcommittee will be in violent consensus with everything, but we'll have good recommendations for the CSMAC's consumption.
Well, Mark and I will be in a good.
Yeah, we'll be in a good.
All right.
If I could add just one.
Go ahead, Dale.
some of this assumes that the FCC is resourced to be able to do something. And I think my understanding right now, their enforcement is largely focused on pirate radio and so forth. So I think there's a real resource. It's theoretically the FCC can come out and help, but I'm not sure at the current resource levels. Now that's way above, of course, our thing, but it's realistic. Realistically, I think there's some real challenges in their ability to do what we're asking them to do.
Okay, with that, I think we'll close that subcommittee. And we'll move on to spectrum efficiency. Brian, are you going to present?
I am indeed. All right. Thank you. And Carolyn's going to help me through this here. So this is the Spectrum Efficiency Subcommittee. We had two questions, so we've had two different tracks of work. Carolyn is leading on the outreach and recommendations on improving efficiency without harming effectiveness with the interviews with the agencies. She'll report on that first, and then I will pick it up from there and discuss the mechanisms and barriers task group. So with that, Carolyn.
Thanks, Brian. So for the federal agency interviews, as part of this, we've been reaching out to federal agencies to get their input into the subcommittee's thoughts, considerations, so that we can make good recommendations in this area. So we have conducted several agency interviews. We interviewed DHS, OMB, and ITS. We also have some upcoming agency interviews with DOD and FAA. There was a schedule change with the FAA interview, but we anticipate getting both of those interviews completed in the next couple of weeks. We have also requested some additional agency interviews with DOJ, NASA, NOAA, and OMB, OFPP. So hope to get as much input from the agencies as possible, because that will help to improve the recommendations that we can put forward. We also reviewed the ITS report on spectrum efficiency studies that Paige and others have mentioned earlier. We're circulating meeting notes, so if we have approval, can incorporate those into our final report as well. And so our next step with this group one is to complete the interviews and to fold that information into our input and recommendations.
Back on, there we go. That's task group one. Task group two, and we've had these three subcommittee calls between February, March, and April, roughly once a month, breaking out both sets of tasks in addition to the interviews that Carolyn referenced. I would like to stress, as we go through the next group of slides, these are all very tentative draft conclusions. Our committee, there's a little bit of an American Idol component to this, in the sense that we have very different views on which proposals have the most promise and what have you, and we've tried to do blended recommendations. But this is still a work in progress. We have tried to be inclusive in our calls in terms of reaching out to everyone on CISMAC who would like to participate, because I do think, particularly when we get to the possible mechanisms going forward, more is better in terms of more contributions about which seem the most promising going forward. So the first step that we asked everyone on the committee to work through was identifying the barriers to efficient secondary market or efficiency type transactions. Those barriers fell into four rough buckets: legal, structural, information gaps, and then other, because we had others. The legal barriers we identified include the Miscellaneous Receipts Act, the Anti-Deficiency Act, the scope and funding mechanisms for the SRF, even after the reforms, and then the inherent limitations of the congressional appropriations process. Structurally, we identified that we would like for NTIA to have more authority and resources. I'm sure we'll get a big fight out of you guys on that. Yeah, exactly. We know our crowd. Additional staffing and general resources from an economic perspective, and then additional administrative burdens, because to the extent that we have wonderful ideas, they still require resources on the government side in order to implement those economic mechanisms. On the information barriers, lack of updated comprehensive data regarding federal spectrum use, so that it's a little more turnkey as opposed to a seemingly more labor-intensive process and less transparent process. And then a lack of transparency on federal spectrum pricing issues, tying back a little bit to the A11 conversation we had earlier. Other barriers identified by the group include the inherently high transaction costs with facilitating these types of market mechanisms, and then a lack of trust in the technology and the regulatory interference resolution processes, which had echoes in our conversation of 3.5 in the last committee report. So we identified all of those as barriers. We then solicited from the group a list of mechanisms that could be deployed to facilitate more efficiency and additional market-based mechanisms here. We leaned heavily on the Institute for Defense Analysis report that was issued in January of 2014, which is quite a good paper if you all haven't reviewed it, admittedly somewhat dated now, that walks through a number of different possible mechanisms, and then we had additional mechanisms that were recommended by the committee. And then we had, this is the American Idol part, we had a matrix that went through how everyone had ranked them to the extent that people participated in that, and then we tried to tier them into the most promising, promising, and least promising, with the theory being that the NTIA would pursue as a first order the most promising ones, then the next promising, et cetera. And to be clear, it's not one over the other. Our suspicion is that these tools would be used at the same time and perhaps adapted to different bands. We did not get into which band for which mechanism, but I think we all agree that we would want to experiment in maybe a test bed sort of way with each of these mechanisms, particularly the most promising ones. So once again, we broke these into, and we have I should mention this as well, we have a draft report. But that report is still a work in progress, and we decided it was much easier to get the slides approved than it would be to get the report approved coming into this meeting, which I regard as a good decision. But we do have a draft report that walks through these, and the most promising on the list included funding, so predictable and flexible funding to support development and implementation of sharing options to increase efficiency, including possible modifications to the SRF. So that's one bucket of things. Increased spectrum property rights, so giving a rights database that would allow property owners to clearly define the rights they have. This is federal users. Make ownership transparent, allow licensees to identify neighbors that may be encroaching upon them, and identify potential targets for negotiation with respect to spectrum use, as well as facilitating market transactions. So a more transparent property rights model for federal agencies. Including the possibility of transferring and retained monies, which we know gets into the controversial part. Third, bidirectional spectrum exchanges or barter swaps, once again empowering federal spectrum users to engage the private sector on a bit more, well, in cooperation with NTIA, of course, in coordination with NTIA, to engage in these types of exchanges, or indeed have the private sector approach federal agencies and have them be able to engage in a dialogue around barters or exchanges. That might be mutually beneficial in the marketplace. And then finally, as I alluded to in our barrier section, increase NTIA authority to allow that to more actively support federal agencies, including managing spectrum through audits, enforcement, and critical examination of spectrum requests. So we would like to make David the king of the world. Is that first?
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
Before you get the next slide. So on spectrum property rights, you are looking at establishing property rights because they don't have them today.
Right.
Okay.
And I suspect it would be a property rights light, even lighter than the commercial side, but something that gives them a little more efficacy around how they manage steward the resource, obviously in a partnership with you all. It was a theory. Okay, then there's the promising mechanisms. Administrative relocation with an overlay. So this is the model, Charla can check me on this, that I don't think has ever been tried. A straight overlay licensee over a federal user with the idea that it would give essentially the private sector in that test bed and the right to negotiate with the federal user around their use and indeed engage in commercial transactions to facilitate continued accomplishment of the federal mission while still facilitating some private sector sharing. So rather than having sort of this group grow big transaction costs notion, you would say, okay, for this band in this location, which commercial entity is most interested in that spectrum? They would bid, they would win an overlay license without essentially secondary rights to the existing federal license holder. And then they would engage in a market-based conversation with no pressure on the federal agency to do anything. But if the commercial provider came up with an economically rational proposal for relocation or for different kinds of use or geographic limitations or what have you, then that transaction would be allowed to move forward. Once again, not clear it would work, but it is another proposal that's out there and it might be worth a test bed. In addition, there's this spectrum auditor notion, which among many of the proposals elicited a robust response from some members of the committee. And it builds on prior CSMAC recommendations regarding A11. OMB would assign us value to spectrum usage and conduct an annual review of agency spectrum holdings, requiring agencies to justify their spectrum needs and pinpoint spectrum to be made available for sharing or leasing. CBO could score the spectrum repurposing in a way that promotes sharing. Administrative challenges, obviously, because the role of auditor would be fairly resource intensive. And there's also big information imbalance in terms of the agency and the auditor. But it does have the advantage of relying primarily on existing institutional relationships in the sense that we audit other resource use in other parts of government. Third, dynamic federal spectrum secondary markets. This is something I think, my perception has had limited success in the commercial context, so I think there's some question about the level of demand. But there would be an ability for federal agencies to make their spectrum available on a temporal basis for short-term lease. And it could be dynamic, real-time auction kind of component. Once again, maybe here too, it's a test bed kind of idea, which I view 3.5 as a similar example of. And so you'd have to find a mechanism to do that. But the idea would be, and maybe this dovetails into the work that Charla and the committee are doing, are there bands where there is enough commercial demand that a spot dynamic market would be economically viable and technically feasible? And so that was another idea. And then finally, greater access to auction revenue. And the notion would be something more robust than the existing Spectrum Relocation Fund, that they would federal agencies would be allowed to retain some portion of auction revenue. The problem, of course, is does that result in an offset in appropriated funds? And if it does, then the whole thing doesn't work at all. So that's a big challenge on this one. But I think the idea of creating an economic incentive for people beyond the existing SRF is a worthwhile goal to pursue. I think everyone agrees this one has some challenges because of the appropriations process. And then last but not least, the least promising, I guess they are least actually, the least promising mechanisms. And I should say that two things were so unpromising they didn't even make least promising. That's how bad it got. Rental fees, shared spectrum, superhighway spectrum currency. This is building off the PCAST report. And then I think an oldie but a goodie, the BRAC, the modeling spectrum management after the Defense Base Closure and Realignment Commission approach. So it's a one-time reallocation of spectrum. And anyway, many barriers to that one. So this is where as I said, our American Idol voting is currently at the moment. But we do want more people to participate, including at this point adding additional mechanisms if something is not here. There's also, I suspect there'll be some parsing of these proposals because some of them have multiple levels in them. So it's a little bit of a work in progress as well. As I mentioned, we do have a draft report that is, in reasonable shape. But the biggest variable is which bucket the various proposals are going to fit into. I am hopeful that we could circulate something well in advance of the July meeting that would give the take on the buckets. I think it'll be important, though, to get input from the full CSMAC in advance of the July meeting on where things fall so that we are able to produce a final report in July. That's the one barrier to July. Because alternatively, we would produce our committee's recommendations for what's in which bucket, and then we could vote on them in September. But if we're trying to get to final in July, we would need to have the full CSMAC engagement, in the month leading up to the July meeting in order to make that work. Got Mr. Reddle to put his tent up. That's scary. Okay.
You brought up NTIA and you brought up Congress. You had to know I was going to chime in.
A Reddle bingo. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. As you guys are looking at these, have you considered how you would square? Some of these would have potentially contradictory outcomes with CBO. the idea of property rights squaring with your auditor function, squaring with greater access to revenue, CBO will look askance at the way those might play together. Are you guys looking at that as you go to figure out which are most promising at the end?
It's a good question, and I think Mary identified the question about how good are these ideas and how achievable are they, and how do those two things work together?
I mean, I didn't even get to achievable. Achievable and CBO are almost never in the same sentence.
Oh, that's a fair point. Anne's having a heart attack because that's the Com Daily headline for tomorrow. So I don't think, and the committee members can weigh in on this. I don't think we pretend to be experts on how CBO works or necessarily being able to always predict how they will view certain proposals. I think we have to unfold that into one of the barriers of achievability, but I don't think anyone on the committee is really expert in this, so it is a problem for what we're trying to do. I mean, all of these ideas are so multifaceted, legally, politically, technically, even before, and then yeah. So it's hard to figure out what metric trumps the others.
Fair enough.
Michael, do you have any? You ready for questions?
Yes.
Michael.
Yeah, Michael Calabrese. I just wanted to also note that it's difficult to look at these completely as standalone. They need to be, I think we also need to work harder at putting them into a context. For example, I'd be very concerned about notions of spectrum property rights for agencies or secondary market transactions unless it is part of a policy framework administered by the NTIA in collaboration with FCC. So, something we've heard here in past years is that, ad hoc transactions may not be feasible or desirable, especially if we're thinking about leaving that to individual agencies. Most obviously, an ad hoc lease could preclude a framework for more general and flexible use of a band in the future. So what if the Navy had just decided to lease to Midwest utilities to use the CBRS band, and then that just put it out of play for the general flexible use that it's going to now on this very intensive basis. For that reason and others, NTIA and not individual agencies should make the decisions about commercial access. For one thing, as we've heard many times from Carl, in particular over the years, is that there's hardly any federal bands that are not occupied by many agencies. And so there's not one agency that should, has or should have any say, any, specific say, and you wouldn't want, and you have many different technologies, not just many agencies crammed into the same bands for efficiency's sake. And also there's the moral hazard of one agency being able to as a strategy, figure that they engage in secondary market transactions that will off. Again, the Navy might like that utility in Iowa to have access to the band and thereby put it out of play for a broader public interest purpose. So the context is going to matter. The policy framework is going to matter for each one of these, and we should make sure we're explicit about that.
I guess just a quick reaction. One is that I do think it was not part of our charge, but I at least have internalized the idea that we are making a proposal for possible test bed use, and I think identifying the bands where you would experiment with these tools is very important, consistent with what you just described, right? So clearly you shouldn't identify a band that is, a prime and been identified for reallocation or for sharing for one of these test beds. But I do think it's worthwhile to try to pursue these tools to see what works, much in the same way we're doing at 3.5, because I think government has to be more comfortable, policymakers, government, commercial entities, all have to be more comfortable experimenting with different tools at this point. And I think if we can get data on something that doesn't work, that's useful.
Go ahead, Rick.
So this is Rick Reeser from Raytheon. I wanted to just mention two things. I'm a big favor of the spectrum property rights idea. Me and Hannah Montana both are on board with that one. So anyway, and I think it plays into this other issue that you get into with other committee, which has to do with the key band characteristics. Because if you could define the sort of the rights of the incumbent and what their baseline is, I think that helps open up the idea about it makes things favorable or not favorable for a band for sharing or reallocation. So I think those two things play together. The other thing I want to bring up was going back to Paige's comment about the OMB circular and the metric in there. In our interviews, and we'll probably get this from the other people we talked to, we've not found anybody who's really found much use in the metric that's in the current circular. Although the Navy did implement it in their new instruction, it has absolutely there's no value to it in terms of what they look at in terms of a metric, because it's based on, basically a commercial wireless, cell phone idea, which is not something that they are kind of into. So one of the things that I would say is I would hope that one of the things we're going to do is make some recommendations about that, or some observations about the current thing. We have been, that's part of our questions and asking things. One of the people didn't even know there was such a thing, to be honest, that we talked to. So the whole idea of what that metric might be is something we're looking at, that you mentioned in the OMB circular. So.
Okay. Janice, did you have your 10 up from last time? No, Dennis, go ahead. Yeah.
Had some hesitancy in
Okay. Just got to point it right. Got to eat it.
Yeah. I've always struggled with this one. Now you can hear me. Because trying to assign, and I struggled with it when we were doing the PCAST report as well, trying to assign the same characteristics to government that are very natural in the commercial sector is very hard. In a situation where you have budgets that are assigned from on high, that the individual agencies don't have real control over, it makes this all very, very difficult. And there are certainly lots of mechanisms that we can explore, and I think it's useful to do so in some respects. But when you get to the bottom line, it really is just fundamentally different. And I will tell a little bit of a homey story about myself. And way back when in IBM, I had responsibility for technology for a division, and I wanted a group of my people to do something in the UK. And they said, unless I funded them, they would not do it. So I funded them. And then in the next budget cycle, I took precisely twice what I had given them out of their budget for the coming year. And the message there is that works the same in Congress, since the organizations function based on monies that are put into them, not based on their revenue or some metrics that are in their control. It really is difficult to use these market-based mechanisms and apply them to the government. So just a word to put in on that.
Thanks, Dennis. Any other comments, questions for this subcommittee? Okay, with that, I think thank you, Brian, and the rest of the efficiency subcommittee. I think we're at the end of the subcommittee portion. So now we have opportunity for public comment on any of the things today. So the first thing we'll do is ask, is there any public comment in the room? So seeing none, I think we'll move on to, is there any comments from the public on the phone? Okay, also hearing none, I think we will move on to closing remarks by the co-chairs. So I'll say a few words, and then I don't know if Mark, if you have anything to add as well. Again, thanks for the good work. It's a lot of work in a short period of time, and I know it's going to be a big crunch between now and July to get these things done. But I have confidence based on what we heard today that we will have a good outcome in July. The only remark that I have today, and I consulted with David, is we're going to have our ethics training, which is always exciting. So we're going to do that right after the close of this meeting. Then we'd like to do one other thing. Since this will maybe the last meeting in D.C., which is always the best attended meeting, but maybe Colorado, we'd like to take a picture. So if everyone could stick around and maybe gather up here, and I checked with David that we're okay with the FACA rules on this. So everyone who's a member, we'll do a picture of everyone who's a member and all the NTIA representatives, liaisons. It would be great. That's my closing comments, Mark.
Other than what Larry said, thanks for all the work. I know that pulling this together is hard. Thanks for all the work you've done, and this has been lively discussion. And I'd like to give an opportunity for David to make any comments he'd like to make. You're good? Okay, great. Paige, do you have any comments? Awesome.
So with that, we'll close the meeting and we'll turn it over to Eric for the ethics training.